Good afternoon and welcome to thinkBIM. We're at what we jokingly call the 4 o'clock spot. It's never quite been at 4 o'clock, but it's always been a different view on things. And so, again, what we wanted to do today was not just look at those technical solutions and understand more in terms of classification and an overview of what the BIM interoperability expert group was doing, but also take a cultural view at it. What does the cultural impacts of interoperability mean? And we're very pleased to have Jenni Barrett and Kirsty Childs, who hopefully have also unmuted themselves now, who are going to lead us through, fingers crossed, a SLIDO led discussion. So I'm going to drive the slides and they are going to start talking. So over to you, Jenni and Kirsty.
Thank you, Duncan, and thanks for having us today. Just to quickly introduce ourselves, my name is Jenni Barrett and I'm Director of CoLab that provides organisational training and strategy about digital team working. And I'm a core team member of Women in BIM as well. And I'm particularly pleased actually that Duncan asked me to talk on this subject because I've actually got a book coming out on the culture of digital team working next year, so I'm looking forward to that. We're doing a bit of a double act. I've got, hopefully, Kirsty, I can't see her, but is unmuted and
I'm here.
Video on. Hi, Kirsty.
Hi,
Kirsty,
Jenni.
is it fair to say that you're an associate at WYG and BIM Ninja there as well? And you're also brilliantly a regional lead for Women in BIM too.
I am indeed, yeah. Just in case anybody's finding the logo at the bottom there confusing, WYG were taken over by Tetra Tech last year and we're currently in the process of rebranding. So from January, we will be known purely as Tetra Tech. And yeah, I'm an associate there. I work mainly within the building services discipline, have done for a couple of decades now. And more recently getting involved in a cross-discipline BIM role.
Okay, so Duncan, if you want to go on to our next slide, I think Kirsty's going to kick off SLIDO polls with us to get a bit more interactivity into the discussion. Let's see if this SLIDO works.
Okay.
Duncan.
Right, so everybody should have already logged in, hopefully, to Slido either through smartphone or opening another web browser app or whatever. The code for the event is capital B382 if you haven't got there already. And there it is. Oh, it's all on the screen. Over to you, Kirsty.
Okay, so a bit of a light-hearted one to start with. Just thinking about how we engage with culture ourselves, which of these do people find entertaining and uplifting? No, Jenni and I had a discussion about this yesterday and found that we're quite different to each other with some of these.
Oh, music's coming out pretty high.
It is.
Right, now the interesting bit in this is going to be, previously when we've used Slido in itself, you could close the poll and freeze the results. I am not aware that I can do that with this amazing integration. So we're just going to talk over results as they sort of settle down. Yeah, but there you are. You have a set of results now, pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay, so listening to music coming out pretty high there, and then quite an even spread across some of the other ones underneath, really. What brought this to mind was having worked with a colleague in the past, getting into a discussion about how she never listened to music because she didn't find it in any way enjoyable. And I found that very, very difficult to deal with, actually. I couldn't even begin to understand where she was coming from, that she didn't enjoy listening to music and would much rather listen to talk radio. So that made me think about the way that we engage with culture personally, and maybe, you know, we're not even, as people, we're not all programmed the same way. and the same things don't mean the same thing to each person that's engaging with it. So hopefully you can see how there's a link there to what we've been discussing.
Okay, shall I move on to the next question?
Please.
Okay. This is, I know, that's doing some really strange things. So even though I've hidden the slides, it's decided to ignore that.
Okay, so this was just to give us an idea of where people sit in the industry. That oh, I thought that'd stop then.
No, we got into just into the 30s last time round, so.
So for me and Jenni, this would be different. I would sit within the one that's currently top there, designer. We're a design consultancy. And Jenni, would be fair to say you'd sit in academia?
Yeah, or maybe other, yeah.
Okay, shall we move on then?
Okay, thank you for that. That's good.
Okay, so that kind of brings us on to kind of how we're going to look at this, really. Obviously, as Kirsty said, and I think from those two slides, is the problem with culture is we're all different, and we can't give a presentation now on the magic silver bullets that will tell you how to prepare the culture for your organisation or your sector of the industry that will allow interoperability to happen. So you have to look at these following slides really from your own kind of perspective, your own understanding where you sit in the industry, and also, you know, you're a human being, your own individual preferences in terms of the way that you need to work as well. So I've put this diagram up. Now, we've all seen diagrams like this over and over again in BIM development, and what I've done here is really just to kick us off, just to sort of distill down into the collaboration elements of what we're looking at here. We know, you know, this is not new to any of us, I'm sure, but we've seen how BIM level 1 is just about coordinating individual documents. We then try and make those documents compatible in some way, and then we try and collaborate, and we move into some kind of file-based co-creation, but we still have a ring-fenced scope of work within that collaborative relationship. Now, that feels like, correct me if I'm wrong, but that feels like where we're at in the industry roughly about now, that we're starting to get to understand how co-creation can work through our BIM models. But now we're kind of saying that we want to move towards interoperability, and I think that takes a whole new level. I think that actually, you know, maybe in 10 years time we'll think that collaboration, a bit like sustainability, is a bit of an archaic word and it's a bit old hat, and actually interoperability becomes about how we work, not just about how our software sit together. So this becomes about how we share ownership of our work, but it also becomes about the interdisciplinary scope of work. We don't have a ring-fenced scope of duties, and actually the boundaries of our disciplines, of our professions, become completely blurred and grey. And I think that's got to happen before we can actually address true interoperability. Could you just, it's not next slide, but it brings the, Duncan, thank you. But I'm aware, and people tell me, that there are significant barriers to that interoperability. I think the previous presentations have also indicated some of these. So now I could kind of regurgitate what I think some of those barriers are, but actually, because this is more of an interactive thing, and also it'll be more interesting to hear from you listening. So if we can go to the next slide, Duncan, I'd like to hear from you. Oh. Is it not come in?
Right.
That one's not.
Oh, what has gone on here? No, we don't have a SLIDO app. Why is it?
Okay.
Sorry, this is going very well. Now you get to ad-lib as well as the rest of us.
I do. Well, okay, you know, I can. Let's improvise here. we'll have to kind of curtail it because I don't want it beeping and going crazy. But but perhaps in the chat, if you could write a handful of people could just write 1 or 2 words in the chat right now, what they think are the main barriers to our progression towards interoperability. I can keep an eye on that and pick those out. Silos, so we've got silos coming through. Tiny sector, yes. Great. People. Language, computer linguistic, excellent. Right, okay. Software vendors, fear of change. Right, okay, you can stop now. The willingness of people to engage, ability and knowledge. Now, I'm just looking at quickly down that list. I see very little that's about tech. I see very little that's about how we write software, how we use software, and how we put things together. What I'm seeing there are loads and loads of people-centric issues, understanding, clients, closed-mindedness, people. And yet when I look at the documentation that's coming out about interoperability, when I look at BIM documentation in general and construction practice guidance, what I see is lots of information about how information is going to be exchanged. So Duncan, could you move us on to the next slide, please? So what I see, I'll turn my chat off as well. What I see are, when I look at BIM guidance right now, I see what I'll call collaboration 1.0, the current version, which is about facts. It's about models, processes, plugins, tasks, objects, data, information. None of that is about people. And what we need to move towards is a collaboration 2.0, which takes us towards interoperability, which is people driven. It's about our interdisciplinary languages. It's about innovation. It's about a shared commitment. It's a shared risk. Are we all motivated to be interoperable? Do we all share the same ethics of information transfer? Do we all share the information? And can we blur the boundaries of how we work together? And because if we can kind of get that happening, then this is key for problem solving, and that's, if we get that right, then our programs will get that right. And this actually echoes something Emma brought up actually about semantic interoperability. Semantic interoperability is where it's a software term really, where we use the words that move between programs and softwares so that IFC, for example, is recognized across these things. But actually semantics is about human linguistics. And that's what when we take this diagram at the bottom here, if we use a semantic interoperability, we keep everybody in the game. We allow people not just to share knowledge, but also to interpret that knowledge and share the imagination of what that final building is going to be like. And it enables us to develop work towards common goals and align as professional disciplines. And if we can do that, if we can align ourselves as people, then we're much more likely to be able to align ourselves in terms of the data and information that we produce. And I think language is really coming out strongly this afternoon because, you know, it's been referenced earlier by Duncan in his news section with Richard Saxon's thing about jargon and the plain language guide, and also Sarah about classification, and then Emma about interoperability people as well. So this is really coming about how we talk to each other as people is vital for how we get our software, if we've got to get that right, to get our software to talk to each other properly as well. And Kirsty's taking the next slide, if that's right, Duncan.
So I was thinking about ways that I've experienced this actually on live project work, and the way that communication can get in the way of that project delivery. So most simplest problems that we had to solve was actually just as an M&E team speaking directly to the architects about the way that they actually model their part of the building. So we might have something like a light fitting or a socket outlet or something like that that's hosted on a wall. And what was happening was that as space planning develops, the architect would delete walls and put new walls back in again. And every time that they did that, all of the things that we'd hosted on the wall would become unhosted. They wouldn't know where they lived in the model anymore. And it would take quite a long time to sort that all out again. Whereas in fact, all the architect had actually done was move the wall. But instead of moving the wall in the model, for some reason, they found it easier to delete it and create a new one. And when I pointed out to them in one of the DTMs how much trouble we were having dealing with that, they said, oh, nobody's ever told us that before. No, nobody had ever actually said that the way that they produced their model could actually impact on one of the other discipline models. So there's this communication that's not happening, that needs to happen better. That was a really simplified example. Sometimes it can be a lot more complicated than that. But there is definitely not just a lack of communication between our software and our data, that we've still got this lack of communication between different members of design teams. And I think that's because partly to do with the culture, that we're looking for different things from the model. So the other things like the IFC classification, which we had that brilliant presentation from Emma, makes it seem so simple, but from practical experience, it's just not the same. And anybody else out there that's used it, I'm sure would agree that there's a world of difference between an IFC export from a model and a good IFC export from a model. Or a window, your software might know to export it as an IFC door, IFC window. But certainly from our MEP point of view, it's not that simple. Revit only sees mechanical equipment as mechanical equipment. So there's actually a manual task there to let it know if that piece of equipment is a boiler or a chiller or an air handling unit. And then even more difficult to explain to somebody who's been working on a drawing board until relatively recently is, why is an IFC boiler got a classification all of its own with a number of predefined types, but an air handling unit is classed as unitary equipment? That's not language that we would usually use within the discipline. So definitely language and communication is still forming one of these barriers. It's not just about the tech. And if we could go on to the next slide, one of the ways that we are trying to overcome this is to actually make sure that what knowledge we do have, that we feel able to share that with all members of the design team, regardless of whether they actually work for the same business or not. And this has been really relevant on a project that I'm currently working on, where instead of spending what could quite literally be weeks checking through IFC data to make sure that the architect, who's not part of Tetra Tech, produces their model in the way that we'd want them to, instead I spent half an hour a couple of times a month actually teaching the architects how we want them to produce this data, so that actually saves me time when it comes to checking it. But we do need to feel empowered and enabled to share that knowledge. Obviously, there is that contractual line is still there, and maybe that's not something that we're used to doing, is actually teaching somebody that we're working with what could be seen as teaching them how to do their job. Shouldn't they know? Well, you know, we've all been there at some point, and if we don't share this knowledge, if we expect every new person coming into BIM to learn everything for themselves and not share the knowledge we've already got with them, then we're just going to end up wasting our time as well as theirs. So I think it's really important that that knowledge sharing is empowered and enabled by our organisations. So we move on to the next slide.
Thanks, Duncan. So there's some threads there that start to tell us how we could possibly create the right culture for interoperability. But it's massive. Culture change always takes a long time, and it's a big job to do. And it's really hard to kind of decide how to move forward. It can be quite overwhelming. So I've split it down here into kind of 3 areas: transactions, themes, and tasks. And transactions are the kind of collaborative contracting elements. We need to move from traditional contracts to contracts that offer opportunities for sharing the risk and rewards for interoperability. This is a basic fundamental psychological principle that we behave much more altruistically if we share a sort of pro-social investment in the contract we're involved in. And so when Kirsty talks about, you know, businesses being able to release their employees to go and teach an architect or an engineer in another organisation how to do some basic skills. If we're going to move to create a culture for interoperability, we need to look at how businesses create interoperability within their core function, and that is something that becomes natural and normal and free, and everybody's free to do. But we also share the flip side is we share the rewards of that too, and that could be monetary, or it could be simply, you know, we get to collectively move the industry forward. And it's about getting all stakeholders invested in the project scope and buying into the cost, quality and schedule proposals at the outset. And so I put limit plugins there, and by plugins maybe I do mean software, but principally I mean people. Sometimes in projects we use people as plugins to the project, and I noticed a comment in the chat earlier that you know, landscape architects sometimes might feel that they come in too late when the brief is already set and there's too many constraints to be able to work with to be able to deliver a valuable project. So if we are going to get interoperability happening, we need to make sure that all disciplines are involved in those pre-collaboration discussions. And in terms of themes, we've got how often do we sit round and talk about our collaboration goals and what our expectations are from each other, and checking that we're all incentivized to work beyond the business as usual performance, the standard way of doing things. Are we all round the table on board to deliver something more? And again, what a lot of people tell me, and a lot of what I hear, is that sometimes it's difficult to address this with clients. How structurally ready are our clients for collaboration? How do their procurement capabilities allow for sharing of risk and reward? And how do they have BIM buy-in at every level of their hierarchy? And how informed are they about the investment in time and money in BIM to be able to deliver the real rewards later? And in terms of tasks, we need to look at ourselves. Are we really facilitating free movement of knowledge, skills and shared goals? Does your business model have interoperability at its core? And do we think beyond the project? We're a bunch of temporary project teams in an industry. But, you know, years ago, Latham, Egan, Farmer have told us to develop social relationships if we're going to share knowledge effectively, if we're going to move forward, and if we're going to innovate. And if we think within the BIM project, within the BIM model on a repeated basis, then we're never going to develop that culture where we start to create an interoperable industry, not just an interoperable set of systems. So, and I think it does echo things that have been said over and over again, and we've made great strides in resolving some of these issues in our industry. But if we don't resolve them fully, then we run the risk of embedding issues of interdisciplinary culture, supply chain integration. We run a risk of embedding those old problems into these new systems that we're designing and running. And this is going to be a real headache and a problem to have to go back and resolve later. Changing culture retrospectively is never as easy as being aware of it now and putting the systems in place. But as I said, this is massive. Culture change is massive. So we can't go away from this conference today and say what are you know, what we're going to do. This is overwhelming. So let's prioritise today through the power of SLIDO to identify what our priorities are. If we can go to the next slide, Duncan.
You know, you're talking about the power of SLIDO.
Yeah.
Is that this one's not working either?
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Oh no! We're
Because
not getting anything for Christmas then.
Well, no. I'm going to tweak it. I was already there before the event even started. Don't worry. What I'm going to do, because I'm also conscious of time, apologies. I'm just going to put both you, Jenni, and Kirsty on the spot and say which one of those which one of those three, because you're not allowed to say other. Which one of the three do you want for Christmas?
Well, clearly for me, it's going to be getting the project team to talk to each other. And Kirsty? Well, I know what we talked about this yesterday, so
it's got to be the same, and by that it would include not just the design team, but the client, the contractor if they're already on board, certainly the FM team. Everybody is included in that, not just people working on that stage of the project.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to the last slide, which isn't a SLIDO slide. And I thought this image summed it up, really. I mean, it's a bit of indulgence in digital capability. This is an image produced by some coders at MIT who were working on artificial intelligence's capability to classify images. And, you know, there's lots of images in there. There's food, you can see water, you can see faces. But what it tells us is that whilst we produce individual pieces of data and information, we produce individual images, if you like, the whole thing can only work if we can really understand how the edges fit together. If we don't understand those edges and interfaces between us and how we can semantically, culturally, behaviourally manage those interfaces, then if we can do that, then we will use the BIM tools more effectively and we will get a better use of the knowledge and human vision that we share. And that will take us to proper, real collaboration, real human collaboration, and take us to real innovation. And I think that's the way to finish. Thank you.